Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are strapping in for, well, a philosophical thrill ride that doesn't just re-examine consciousness, it really attempts to fundamentally relocate it.
Uh-huh.
This theory claims that basically everything you thought you knew about where your mind resides, inside your skull is completely wrong.
That's right. I mean, for centuries, we've sort of been locked into this worldview, haven't we? Inherited from the Enlightenment, really,
Yeah.
that separates the subjective mind from the objective world. We're looking at Riccardo Manzotti's 2018 book, The Spread Mind, Why Consciousness and the World Are One.
Right.
So today we are diving into the spread mind theory, which is, a radical proposition. It tries to dismantle this dualism entirely.
So our mission is, well, simple to state, but the implications are just staggering. We're investigating the claim that conscious experience is not an internal event inside the brain, but is, in fact, numerically identical to the external physical object or event you are currently perceiving. So if I see a cup, my experience is that cup.
Exactly. It's an identity claim of the highest order, really. It suggests that if we define things like objects and time and causality correctly, well, maybe we don't actually need to invent a separate subjective realm. But, and this is the big but, making that claim work requires a complete overhaul of, well, physics and metaphysics as we know them. It's a big ask.
Okay, let's start with the foundational problem this theory is trying to solve, this enduring problem of the mental gap. Where did we even get this idea that our experience in the world are fundamentally separate things?
Well, we've been living with this kind of conceptual architecture since Descartes, Kant, really. Western thought established this necessary separation. Appearance is distinct from reality, experience is distinct from objects, and mind is distinct from nature.
Yeah.
And this gap is basically the reason we have the perennial hard problem of consciousness. It stems directly from that split.
It really is the dualistic hangover, isn't it? And it's profoundly impacted science, too. The prevailing belief, and I agree with the source material here, it's a rather depressing belief.
It is
that our mind is always kind of one step behind the world. We think we're locked inside our heads, perceiving this highly filtered, virtual reality that's just concocted by the brain's neural activity.
Yeah, and this idea is just pervasive in classical neuroscience.
Yeah.
I mean, the source highlights Wilder Penfield's famous brain stimulation experiments from the mid-20th century.
Right, the ones where he touched parts of the brain.
Exactly. And while Penfield revealed a lot about localization of function, his findings, and maybe more importantly, the subsequent interpretation of those findings, led many to conclude that the brain generates these experiences internally.
And you see that mirrored in computational models too, right? Thinkers like David Marr, who posited that the visual system creates this whole series of representations, like a 2.5D sketch, then a 3D model, meaning that only an indirect model of the external world is ever available to the mind. The brain is the generator, and we're just sort of passive viewers of this internal 3D movie.
It creates this really profound sense of, well, claustrophobia almost.
Yeah.
If the outside world is silent and dark, totally devoid of qualities, and all my rich qualitative experience, the quality is generated internally, then I'm essentially just a spectator of my own neural activity, cut off.
So, okay. The spread mind theory steps into this picture with this radical hypothesis: identity, not representation.
Exactly. The core idea, and it's deceptively simple, is that the thing that is my conscious experience, it's not a simulation, it's not some inner ghost, it's not a representation.
Okay.
It is the very physical object I am conscious of. The source is really unambiguous here. My experience of a red apple is the apple itself. The subject is the object. The experience is numerically identical to the physical reality out there.
Now, hang on. That sounds utterly absurd to anyone, steeped in neuroscience or even just common sense. If my experience of redness is on the apple, what on earth is my brain doing? And where is this experience located?
Right, and the claim forces an immediate necessity.
Yeah.
If experience is physical, which this theory insists it is, it must be located somewhere observable and natural. We should find it alongside, as the source puts it, electrons, pebbles, and parrots.
Okay.
The centuries-long invisibility of the mind is maybe highly suspicious precisely because we've been looking for it inside the brain. But maybe it's always been right in front of us, just hiding in plain sight as the world itself.
Okay, but what about all the data, the mountains of data we have showing brain scans lighting up when we perceive things, fMRI scans? Isn't that proof the experience is happening there in the brain?
Well, it's proof of correlation, definitely.
Hmm.
But it's not necessarily proof of identity.
Mm.
The philosopher Tim Crane noted this quite nicely. He said, fMRI technology does not solve the mind-body problem. If anything, it only brings it more clearly into relief.
Mm.
So the neural activity, say in the fusiform gyrus, when you see a face, that's physical activity, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's activity happening at the very end of a complex causal chain.
Yep.
It might be the effect of the experience taking place, or perhaps the necessary condition for the experience to occur, but it's not the experience itself. Think of it like this. If I flip a light switch that turns on a massive stadium light,
Right.
the activity in the switch is necessary, obviously, but the switch itself is not identical to the light shining way out there on the field.
Okay, I see the distinction. So the brain is merely a necessary condition, maybe a causal bottleneck, like the switch.
Exactly.
So if we accept this radical identity that the experience is the external object, then yeah, we absolutely must redefine the object itself. We need a physical object that is somehow capable of being an experience.
Precisely. The whole mental gap problem, the theory argues, arose because we started with this oversimplified, abstracted notion of physical objects. So the revision required is profound. Objects aren't silent, they're not atemporal, they're not absolute.
Okay.
They are instead relative and causally dependent on our bodies, and crucially, they're spread across space and time. They have duration.
All right, the stage is set then. Our goal for the rest of this deep dive is to see if this revised physics, this new way of looking at objects and time, allows us to explain all forms of conscious experience. You know, normal perception, misperception, memory, even hallucination as identity with these newly defined physical objects. The old leftover appearance model, as the source calls it, must fall.
That's the challenge. Let's see if it holds up.
Okay, let's dig into this flawed traditional model first. What exactly is wrong with how we usually think of a physical object, like, say, a table?
Well, the source calls it the Galilean object. This model really emerged from the scientific revolution, when thinkers like Galileo were trying to make the world mathematically tractable, predictable.
Right, measurable.
Measurable, exactly. And to do that, he drew a very sharp distinction between what he called objective quantities, things you could measure, the primary qualities like shape, size, number, motion, and the subjective qualities, the secondary qualities like tastes, odors, colors, things that seem to depend on the observer.
So the actual experienced world, the world of blue skies and red apples, as the source puts it, the qualitative richness that really defines our lives, that got immediately pushed aside, relegated to the subjective domain deemed scientifically unreliable.
Precisely. The real world, for science, became this abstraction, silent, dark, colorless, unperceivable directly, and defined only by mathematics. And this abstraction suffers from what philosophers sometimes call the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Meaning, we mistake a useful scientific abstraction, this silent, dark universe useful for prediction, for the actual, richly detailed reality we actually inhabit. Galileo himself famously said that true science required doing violence to the senses, basically rejecting the experienced world in favor of the measured one.
And that Galilean object is also conceived as absolute and atemporal, right? Meaning it just exists independently of any observer or any causal process happening.
Which is another critical error, according to this theory. Everything we experience, and indeed everything that causes an effect, is embedded in temporally extended causal processes. Nothing just is, statically. The Galilean object is fixed, like a snapshot.
Okay.
The object of the spread mind theory, in contrast, is defined as relative, active, causal, and temporally constituted. It's dynamic.
All right, let's focus on that causal relationship first. How is the physical object relative to my body? That sounds a bit idealistic, like Berkeley or something.
Good point. But it's different. It's not mind-dependent, it's body-dependent, which is crucial. The object, let's stick with the apple, doesn't exist autonomously as an experience for you. Its existence as experience is causally relative to your body.
How so?
Well, your body acts as the necessary causal circumstance. Think of it like this. If you have a specific frequency of light bouncing off the apple skin, that frequency doesn't automatically become the color red all by itself. It requires a specific, biochemically structured human visual system, your eyes, your optic nerve, your visual cortex, to complete the causal chain that results in the experience of red.
So the body is like the necessary switch, as you said before, but it's not the source of the current, the redness itself.
Exactly, you got it. The body is the switch, the apparatus, that allows the causal current originating from the apple, like reflecting specific light wavelengths, to flow and bring the object into existence as experience for you. But the body doesn't create the apple or its redness out of whole cloth.
Okay.
So the resulting red apple experience is therefore body-dependent, physically dependent on your specific biological setup, but it's not mind-dependent in some spooky, non-physical way. It remains a physical event, but its properties are relational, dependent on the interaction.
And this also emphasizes the activity inherent in the object, right? If the apple wasn't actively doing something, it wouldn't exist for me as an experience.
Correct. The apple has to do substantial causal work, as the source puts it. If it were causally inert, if it didn't reflect light, if it didn't release aroma molecules, if it didn't have a certain texture to push back against my fingers, it would be unperceivable and thus ontologically dark in our experience. The object is defined by its ability to act as an actual cause that produces physical effects, effects which culminate in our body.
Okay, here's the concept that I think takes the most getting used to, defining these experience properties, color, warmth, shape, as relative physical properties. Let's go back to that analogy you mentioned, the one about relative velocity. That might help.
Right, the velocity analogy is helpful, I think. Think about motion. If a train is moving at, say, 100 miles per hour, that velocity is always relative to something, usually the ground. Now, if you're an observer on a second train moving at 50 miles per hour in the same direction, the first train's velocity relative to you is only 50 miles per hour. Same physical train, same motion, but it instantiates different velocities depending on the frame of reference you choose.
Okay, so the body, with its specific chemistry, its neural structures, its sensory organs, it acts as a highly complex sort of causal reference frame for physical properties.
Precisely. Just as the same train has different speeds relative to different observers, the same physical stuff, say, the molecules on the apple's skin interacting with light, has different colors, maybe even slightly different perceived sizes or textures relative to different bodies.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about color adaptation. If you stare at a bright green field for a minute and then look at a white wall, the wall might appear slightly pinkish or pale red for a moment.
Right, I've experienced that.
It's the same physical whiteboard, the same light hitting it, but its color property relative to your specific visual system, which has just been adapted by the green light, is temporarily different. It instantiates pale red relative to you in that moment.
Okay, this is the critical insight then. All the features we traditionally quarantined off into the subjective experience, bucket color, temperature, taste, perceived shape, they're actually relative physical properties. They're still physical, still actual properties of the interaction, but they depend on the specific causal structure of the perceiver's body.
Which, if you follow it through, fundamentally eliminates the need for subjectivity itself, in the old sense. Everything remains physical, but its instantiation, how it shows up, is relational. It depends on the relationship.
Wow. Okay. And this brings us right to that classic philosophical conundrum, the one that, used to make me scratch my head in college. If a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound?
Under the spread mind theory, the answer is a straightforward and maybe surprisingly absolute. Negative. No sound.
Whoa, wait, hold on. I feel like I need to push back on that a bit. Philosophers have debated this for centuries. Are you saying the air pressure waves, the vibrations in the air, all that measurable physical stuff that doesn't exist if no one's there?
No, absolutely not. The physical stuff exists. The vibrating air molecules, the pressure waves propagating outwards, all that happens physically. But the sound, the phenomenal quality of sound as we experience it, does not.
Why not?
Because sound, as we experience it, is a relative physical property. Just like velocity, it requires a frame of reference to actually take place. An air molecule vibrating in isolation has no sound property.
Okay.
Sound, the experience, requires a body, a specific auditory system like an ear and a brain, to complete the causal loop. If the human body or an animal's body with hearing isn't there to transduce those specific patterns of air pressure waves, to single them out and process them, then the property of sound is absent.
So the tree falling produces the causal potential for sound.
Exactly. Well put.
But the sound property itself is only actualized, only comes into being, through the presence of the required causal circumstances, which includes a hearing body.
Precisely. The physical conditions are there, but the relational property sound isn't instantiated without the relata, without the ear being part of the system.
That is a very neat, deeply unsettling resolution to that old problem.
Yeah.
It basically replaces subjective mind stuff with relative causality.
And this whole concept is underpinned by something called the Eleatic principle, which basically says to be is to have causal powers.
Right. Philosophers like Samuel Alexander and Jae-Gwon Kim championed this idea. If something is just an epiphenomenon like a byproduct that has no causal power of its own, then it doesn't really exist in a meaningful physical sense. It can't do anything.
And our experience, under this spread mind theory, is made of actual causes. It's not some fluffy, non-physical thing floating around having no effect. It's the very moment when physical causality concludes in an effect relative to our body.
So existence itself is defined by this actualization, by this causal happening.
Yes. An object's existence as experience is its taking place as a cause of effects relative to us. Before that specific causal occurrence happens, it's merely potential, just possibility. The source quotes T.S. Eliot beautifully here. What might have been is an abstraction remaining a perpetual possibility. The moment an object, the apple reflecting light right now, becomes causally relevant to my body, it transitions from mere possibility to an actual cause. And that actual cause, that completed causal event, is my experience. And importantly, every time I look at that apple, it's technically a new instance, a new token of the experience, because it's a new causal occurrence taking place.
Okay, now we get to the real proving ground, don't we? The traditional argument for internal representations, for that gap between mind and world, relies almost entirely on misperception. Optical illusions, things like that. If the object is the experience, how on earth can we explain illusions where what we see isn't what's really there according to a ruler?
Right. Illusions are the historical smoking gun, the key evidence used to prove that necessary split between appearance and reality. The logic goes, since the experience, like seeing two lines having different lengths in the Mueller-Lyer illusion, doesn't match the measured reality where the lines are actually the same length, then the experience must be happening inside, in some mental domain that doesn't perfectly mirror the external world. It's a mental interpretation or distortion.
Makes sense traditionally. But the spread mind theory counter-argues, quite poetically, that we actually live in Shangri-La. What does that mean?
Shangri-La is used here as a metaphor for a hypothetical, nomologically possible place, a world consistent with the laws of physics, where experience always equals reality. It's a world where, just by chance or design, misperception never occurs.
So a place with no optical illusions.
Exactly. If you live there, if you never saw a curved line appear straight or lines seem different lengths when they weren't, you would simply have no reason to doubt that seeing is being. When you see red, something red is physically present relative to you. There'd be no evidence for an inner world deviating from the outer.
Okay, so the radical maneuver here is to state that illusions, as we experience them in our world, are not actually misperceptions at all. They are simply misbeliefs.
Exactly. The illusion, let's take the Miller-Lyer lines again, is understood not as faulty perception, but as a clash. It's a clash between what one actually perceives, which the theory claims is a real, relative, physical property genuinely present in the stimulus, and what one believes one ought to perceive, a belief usually dictated by some external authority, like abstract measurements with a ruler or Galileo telling us to perform violence to the senses.
Okay, I'm still having trouble with this one. How can the physical world actually contain the property of the lines being different lengths, even if a ruler tells me they're the same? That seems contradictory.
Right. This is where we have to distinguish very clearly between the proxy, physical properties we actually perceive, and the alleged properties defined by abstract science or measurement tools operating under different conditions.
Proxy versus alleged. Okay.
In the Miller-Lyer illusion, the key is that the lines are not seen in isolation, are they? They are seen as part of a physical composite object that includes those inward or outward pointing arrowheads or fins. The entire configuration line plus fins instantiates a real physical property, a proxy property that our visual system is attuned to picking out. It just so happens that this particular property, related to angles and junctions, strongly correlates with perspective cues for distance or length in three-dimensional space in our normal environment.
So the visual system isn't making a mistake, it's correctly perceiving a real, complex, physical property of the 2D drawing.
Exactly.
And that property happens to trigger mechanisms usually associated with differing lengths in 3D.
Precisely. The physical experience itself, seeing them as different, is real. It's identical to that complex proxy property. The misbelief comes when we assume this physical experience must match the abstract measurement of just the line segments in isolation, ignoring the context.
Okay, let's try applying this proxy property idea to some specific examples. Take the classic mirage in the desert. Everyone says, I was tricked. I saw water where there was only hot air. How does spread mind explain that?
Under spread mind, you weren't tricked, perceptually speaking. You experience the standard, correct perception of a real physical property, which is something like behaving as a horizontal mirror reflecting the sky.
Okay.
Now, this proxy physical property is genuinely shared by both calm pools of water and by superheated layers of still air near the ground, which bend light in just that way. Your visual system correctly picks up the common causal pattern, the proxy property, because that is what's visually available. That's the physical reality interacting with your eyes.
So the error isn't in seeing the mirror effect, it's in jumping to the conclusion, the belief, that the only possible object instantiating that property must be water.
Exactly. The belief is the error, not the perception.
The
The perception is of the real physical property, sky reflecting surface.
The clarity there is actually quite compelling. Okay, let's try apparent temperature. When I touch a piece of metal versus a piece of wood at the exact same room temperature, the metal feels much colder. My experience of coldness is different, so traditionally, that difference must be created internally in my mind or brain.
Traditionally, yes, that's the go-to explanation. But here we apply the same logic. We realize we do not perceive the alleged abstract property, like Fahrenheit temperature or average molecular kinetic energy of the object.
Right.
We perceive the proxy property, which in this case is something like the rate of localized chemical activity or heat transfer occurring in our skin.
Ah, okay. So the metal, being highly thermally conductive, draws heat away from your skin much more rapidly than the wood does,
Right.
triggering a stronger chemical neural reaction in the skin receptors that signals cold. The wood, being a poor conductor, causes a much slower heat transfer and thus a different, weaker signal.
Precisely. So the two objects, metal and wood, are genuinely producing two different actual physical processes in your skin, even though their abstract ambient temperature is the same. That localized physical process in your skin is the poled experience. It's an identity.
And the source notes that this explains things like menthol too, right?
Yeah.
Menthol feels cold but isn't actually cold.
Exactly. Menthol molecules trigger the very same physical chemical process, the same nerve receptors, TRPM8 channels actually, in the skin that low temperature does. So if a cold iron bar and a menthol candy applied to the skin can instantiate the same physical property relative to your bodily frame of reference, thereby producing the same experience of coldness. Your experience isn't mistaken. It's an identity with a highly specific, localized physical property happening at the boundary of your body.
Okay, this framework is surprisingly robust. Let's move to a classic color illusion, Benham's top. It's just a black and white disc, but when you spin it, people see flashes of pale color, reds, yellows, blues. If there's no actual color in the physical input stimulus, where is the physical color coming from according to this theory? It seems like a perfect case for internal generation.
It does seem like that, but the crucial move, again, is to redefine the object. The spinning disk is a physically different object than the static disk. Motion changes its properties relative to an observer. When that specific black and white pattern spins at a certain speed, the resulting pale color you perceive is claimed to be a real relative physical property instantiated by the spinning object relative to the specific temporal integration time of the human visual system.
You mean because our retina and subsequent neural processing have a relatively slow response time, there's a kind of persistence of vision, and the rapid alternation of black and white patches interacts with that timing to create a new physical property?
Precisely. It's about the interaction over time. Think about it this way. If you used a camera with a slow shutter speed to photograph the spinning top, what would this snapshot look like?
It would just be a blur, probably a uniform gray blend of the black and white.
Exactly. That gray is a real physical property of the object relative to the slow camera system. The pale red or blue perceived by our eye with its own specific and different temporal processing characteristics is the equivalent real physical property of the object relative to the human visual system. We don't need to invent a mental red conjured by the brain. We just need to recognize that the physical object, in relation to our specific perceptual system, changed when it started spinning and interacting with our visual timing.
Wow. Okay, and one more quick one. The Canissa triangle illusion, where we perceive a bright white triangle sitting on top of three black Pac-Man shapes, even though no actual triangle lines are drawn, that feels like the brain filling in the gaps.
Again, the theory argues it's not a mental concoction or filling in. The visual system is accurately singling out a real proxy property present in the stimulus. This property is something like the existence of three visually salient aligned angles whose implied sides approximately conjoin.
Okay, that's a mouthful, but I see. It's a structural property.
It's a real geometric physical property that is shared by many phenomena in the world. including actual triangles,
Mm.
but also instantiated by those three carefully placed Pac-Man shapes. When the shapes are arranged just so, they physically instantiate that proxy property, and that physical property is what we perceive. The identity holds. Experience is that real, albeit complex and relational, physical property.
All right, so if illusions can be explained away as misbeliefs about real, albeit sometimes complex or relative physical properties, the last great citadel of internalism, the place where the mind seems undeniably creative, has to be the hallucination.
Absolutely.
And the traditional model, championed by figures like David Chalmers sometimes, often tries to sort of equate normal perception with reliable hallucination. The idea being the brain is always generating a show.
It is a curious explanatory strategy, isn't it? Explaining the normal, everyday case by appealing to the unusual pathological case. They argue that since the brain seems to generate content during a hallucination, when there's apparently nothing out there, it must just be generating content all the time, and perception is just when that internal generation happens to match the world.
Right. It makes perception seem like a controlled dream.
But if the spread mind theory is right, if all experience is perception of actual physical objects, we have to reverse this logic completely.
Okay, so what's the spread mind reversal? How does it explain hallucinations?
The claim is bold. Hallucinations are spatiotemporally reshuffled perceptions. Every single element of a hallucinated experience, no matter how bizarre it seems, must ultimately be traceable back to some actual physical object or event encountered somewhere in space and time. Nothing is truly created ex nihilo by the brain.
Reshuffled perceptions, like a collage made from old photos.
That's a decent analogy, yeah. To make this plausible, though, we have to revisit Wilder Penfield's famous work on brain stimulation, because that's often cited as the definitive evidence against this kind of view, proof that the brain generates experience internally.
Okay, refresh my memory. What specifically did Penfield find when he directly stimulated the temporal lobes of conscious patients during surgery?
This is the really crucial and often misunderstood or misinterpreted detail. According to the source material reanalyzing Penfield's reports, the electrical stimulation never produced entirely new, pristine experiences. He didn't get reports of, seeing dragons or hearing completely novel symphonies, that kind of extraordinary, unique hallucinations that would prove the brain can just conjure reality from scratch.
So what did patients report?
They reported reshuffled combinations or re-experiencing fragments of past events they had genuinely lived through. Things like hearing their mother talking during a specific prior family dinner, or seeing a particular scene they had witnessed weeks or years before, maybe hearing a song they knew. It was always grounded in past reality.
So the interpretation here is that the brain doesn't generate the content. It acts more like a causal gate or maybe a kaleidoscope.
Precisely. The brain doesn't invent the raw content, the sights and sounds themselves. It merely allows existing content identical with remote past physical objects and events, to become present causes, maybe in new combinations. Think of the brain as a highly complex switchboard or maybe a filter system that can, when artificially stimulated or malfunctioning, reroute signals or lower thresholds, allowing causal influences from the past to become effective, to get through in the present.
Okay, but I need to ask the skeptical listener's question again here. If the mind isn't really in the brain, just using it as a gate, why does brain damage, like a stroke or injury, cause such specific and devastating loss of function, like aphasia, losing language, or prosopagnosia, losing face recognition? Doesn't that strongly suggest those functions, those parts of the mind, are located right there in the damaged tissue?
That's an excellent and absolutely necessary objection to address. The theory doesn't deny the brain's critical role. It states the brain is the causal bottleneck, or the necessary enabling infrastructure. If the gate is destroyed or a crucial part of the plumbing is broken, then the causal flow that normally enables the external object, like spoken words or a face, to take place as experience is blocked or disrupted.
So the infrastructure is gone.
Right. The brain is the necessary physical apparatus for the physical experience, which is the external object, to occur relative to the organism. Going back to the plumbing analogy, if the pipes leading to your tap are broken, the water doesn't cease to exist back in the reservoir, but the local flow of water to your sink is destroyed.
Okay.
So aphasia isn't the destruction of language itself stored inside the brain. It's the destruction of the specific complex physical mechanism necessary to complete the causal loop with the external world of language sounds or written symbols, preventing them from being experienced as language. The capacity for that specific interaction is lost because the biological hardware is damaged.
Okay, that clarifies the brain's role as critical infrastructure, not necessarily the container. Now, back to hallucinations. How does a past object, maybe something from years ago, become a present cause? This mechanism of double preemption you mentioned needs a bit more unpacking than just the switchboard idea.
Right, okay. So the idea is that in our normal waking state, there's an internal neural blockade. Think of it as an active inhibitory mechanism within the brain. Its job is essentially to constantly prevent the causal flow from the vast majority of remote past objects and events from reaching completion, from becoming present experience.
Why? Why block the past?
Well, if we perceived everything that has ever causally affected us all at once, we'd be utterly overwhelmed, completely unable to function in the here and now. It's an essential filter for focusing on the immediate, practical, present environment we need to interact with.
Makes sense. A necessary filter.
Yes. Now, a hallucinogenic event may be taking a drug like LSD, or having an epileptic seizure, or even Penfield-stimulating electrode acts as a double preempting cause. It does two things simultaneously, according to this model.
Okay, what are they?
First, it preempts or disrupts the normal causal flow coming from the immediate present environment. It essentially interferes with the brain's processing of current sensory input, causing that external world to temporarily cease being the dominant experience. That's the sort of blockade of present experience people often report on psychedelics.
Right, the world looks distorted or dissolved.
Exactly. But second, and crucially, it simultaneously switches off or bypasses the internal neural blockade that normally inhibits those remote past causes. It opens the gates to the past, so to speak.
Okay. So the disruptive cause, the drug, the electrode, whatever, achieves two things. It kind of silences the immediate now, or at least messes with it, and it opens up a channel to the spread now that includes the past.
Exactly. And this allows those past objects, the original physical scenes, the sounds, the feelings, separated by maybe seconds, days, or even years, to exert their latent causal influence and be experienced now as if present. The hallucination of, say, a friend who died years ago isn't the brain creating an image, it's the postponed perception of the actual physical events constituting that friend's life and your interactions with them, enabled by the disruptive cause which temporarily bypasses the normal temporal filtering constraints.
So this puts memory, dreams, and hallucinations all on a single continuum, really. They're all forms of perception, just differing perhaps by the temporal distance or the causal pathway involved for the objects they're identical with.
That's the idea. And the final piece of evidence the source brings up to support this external origin, even for seemingly internal phenomena, comes from research on congenitally totally blind subjects, people blind from birth who have never experienced light.
Right, because the myth is that the brain can just cook up colors or images internally in isolation.
Precisely. Now, consider phosphenes. Those are the simple flashes or patterns of light people see when there's no light entering the eye, maybe from pressing on your eyeball or a bump to the head, or electrical stimulation of the visual cortex.
I know what you mean.
Now, if the visual cortex truly generated visual content internally from scratch, then congenitally blind subjects who have never had any causal entanglement with light should still report seeing visual phosphenes when their visual cortex is stimulated, just like sighted people do.
Okay, that makes sense. So do they?
The evidence, according to the source, consistently shows they do not. They might report tingling or other sensations, but not the experience of light flashes.
Why not?
Because, the theory argues, their visual cortex lacks the necessary causal history with light. Phosphenes aren't created internally out of nothing. They are the postponed perception of light, perhaps caused by very faint residual effects of original optical phenomena, like ambient light scattering inside the eye from years ago or random neural firing patterns established by past light, which is only brought to the level of conscious experience, only reaches completion by the disruptive stimulus, the pressure, the electrical pulse acting now.
So if there was no initial causal history with light,
There's no past physical object, light phenomena, stored or reverberating in the system waiting to be perceived, even in this postponed way. There's no causal echo to amplify. This seems to confirm that the basic physical components of experience, even simple flashes of light, must ultimately originate in interactions with the actual physical world. Imagination itself, then, is limited to being a recombination, a reshuffling of these physically encountered parts. Identity, the spread now, and the self.
wow, okay, this entire framework, if we accept it, forces us to really rethink time itself, doesn't it? If experience can effectively reach back years into the past through these causal chains, we absolutely have to abandon the idea of a punctual, instantaneous now.
We absolutely do. Experience is intrinsically temporal. It requires duration. It simply cannot fit into a dimensionless mathematical point in time. The classic example, going way back, is Father Bourdain's objection to Descartes. A man heard a clock strike 4 times. Those 4 distinct chimes take physical time to occur and be perceived. They can't all be crammed into an instantaneous now.
So instead of the pinpoint now, we need to introduce the concept of the spread now.
Exactly. The spread now isn't conceived as a time slot that contains experience. The spread now is an experience. It's defined as a chunk of reality singled out by causal boundaries. It's the duration of the object relative to body event taking place.
And the duration of the spread now is variable.
Completely variable. Experiencing the redness and shape of the apple might take place over milliseconds. Experiencing a full piece of music involves a spread now lasting minutes. But think about looking at the night sky. Looking at the star Sirius, which is about 8.6 light years away, means your current experience of seeing Sirius is numerically identical to a physical event. Photons leaving Sirius, that actually took place 8.6 years ago. You're now in that moment stretches back almost a decade.
So the time of my experience is literally the time spanned by the objects or events I experience. As they conclude their causal journey relative to my body, my consciousness is temporally spread out.
Yes. And this means the past isn't simply gone. It's still present, in a way, because it can be a constitutive cause of the present experience. The experience of the object occurs when its causal process finally concludes relative to the body's processing. This might even shed light on things like PTSD, where subjects often report feeling like their present is still stuck in those terrible moments. Perhaps the original traumatic events continue to exert their causal influence so strongly in the present, through deeply ingrained neural loops or pathways, that they dominate the spread now.
So the perceived gap between past and present isn't strictly ontological then, but maybe more practical.
Precisely. It becomes largely a practical distinction based on the conditions of interaction. I can interact with the nearby apple right now. I can reach out and grab it. I cannot interact with the star Sirius as it was 8.6 years ago.
Right.
This practical difference in my ability to engage causally now defines what we tend to categorize as past versus present, even though both might be part of my current spread now experience.
Okay. We established that experience is identical to the external object, understood relatively. Now, we need to address the implication this has for concepts like representation or information, which are central to cognitive science. The theory demands simplicity here, right?
Yes, the ruling principle is incredibly strict. Thou shalt have no other relations before identity. Basically, if you find yourself saying that some mental state X represents an external thing Y, the theory pushes back and insists that, fundamentally, X must be Y.
How does that work?
Well, it immediately eliminates the need for traditional mental representations. These are usually conceived as some kind of physical state in the brain, like a pattern of neural firing, that somehow has to stand for or carry the content of the external object. But how does a pattern of firing acquire the qualitative property of redness or the shape of a cat? It seems impossible unless that neural pattern is somehow identical with the red cat itself, which seems unlikely if the pattern is in the head and the cat is outside.
So only the object itself have the properties of the object.
Exactly. So if experience has those properties, experience must be the object. No middleman, no representation needed. Identity first.
Okay, and what about information? Especially in the digital age, we constantly talk about memory as storing information, like data files on a hard drive in the brain. How does spread mind handle memory without information storage?
Yeah, the theory challenges the very notion of information as some kind of stuff or internal content that gets stored and retrieved. Instead, it views information as simply a quantitative description of causal relations and dependencies. It doesn't reify information into a thing.
So how does memory work then? How do we remember things if we're not storing them? The source uses the domino tile analogy, right?
Yes, the domino analogy is brilliant for getting intuition here. Let's walk through that slowly. Imagine a long row of dominoes standing on end.
Okay.
You push the first one, it falls and causes the next one to fall, and so on. A perturbation, a causal influence, propagates down the line. That's a basic causal process.
Right, simple cause and effect.
Now, memory, or computation for that matter, isn't about storing the image or the idea of the first tile somehow in the last tile. It's simply about the reliable propagation of that initial causal perturbation through the structure of the system. The effect of the first push is carried forward causally.
Okay, but how does that explain retaining a memory over a long time? The row of dominoes stops falling eventually. The effect dissipates.
But that's where the structure becomes key. What if you arrange the domino tiles, or some more complex causal elements like neurons, in a closed loop? Imagine a circle of dominoes where the fall of the last one triggers the first one again, maybe via some resetting mechanism.
A loop.
You could call it a causal eddy or reverberating circuit. In such a structure, the initial perturbation, the effect of the first cause, can be made to propagate indefinitely. The system keeps cycling, keeping the causal chain going.
Ah, so the memory of, say, my grandmother's face isn't a static picture file stored in my hippocampus. It's more like an ongoing, self-sustaining, physical, causal process looping through certain neural circuits.
Exactly.
A process that was initiated by the original physical object, seeing my grandmother's face, and which allows that original object, or rather its causal consequence, to become present again, to become an actual cause now whenever that loop is activated or accessed.
Precisely. The past event remains dynamically present because it keeps producing an effect through that established neural loop structure. No storage of content needed, just ongoing causal propagation.
And does the same principle apply to imagination? When I imagine something fictitious, like a flying pink elephant, where does that physical object come from if everything has to be rooted in actual physical reality? It can't just be created from nothing by the brain.
Right. According to the theory, even chimeras, these fantastical creations, are still ultimately composed of real physical components. They are spatiotemporally composite objects built entirely from reshuffled, actual physical parts or properties encountered in the past.
Like the kaleidoscope analogy again.
Exactly like the kaleidoscope. You've actually experienced elephants or pictures of them. You've experienced the property pink, and you've experienced the property flying, birds, planes. Imagination is the process, enabled by brain activity, that takes these fragments of past physical perception and recombines them into a new, complex physical object, the pink flying elephant, that is actualized now relative to your internal causal loops and your body.
So imagination doesn't create genuinely new qualia or properties, it just rearranges existing ones.
That's the claim. It expands the ontology of the experienced physical world, but only by recombining real elements that were already encountered. It makes the world richer by reshuffling its parts.
Okay. After this absolutely sweeping revision of physics, time, causality, perception, illusion, hallucination, memory, imagination, let's try to conclude with the ultimate question. Where then is the mind, and where is the self?
Well, the conclusion has to be that the traditional conceptual distinction between inner and outer is largely a remnant of the old, flawed model. It's a conceptual artifact we don't need anymore. The brain and body are the complex causal gate, the necessary biological apparatus. But they were not the location of the phenomenal world itself. The mind, the experience, is not located in the brain.
So the self, then, it's not the hidden internal entity, the ghost in the machine that we always assumed.
No. If experience is identical with the objects experienced, then the self, the I that has these experiences, seems to become identical with the collection of causally relevant spread objects that constitute your current spread now. The source puts it very simply but profoundly. I am a now. I am this particular causally unified chunk of reality taking place relative to this body.
So the mind was hidden in plain sight all along.
That's the implication. It is the physical object itself, or rather, the world of physical objects, apprehended through the unique causal structure and history of your particular body.
We have really completed quite a journey here, haven't we? Moving from that, well, gloomy Cartesian zombie world model,
Right.
where you have this silent, dark, qualityless universe outside, only occasionally lit by the fleeting sparkle of the mind trapped inside the skull, to a world where experience, reality, and nature are potentially one and the same thing, where the richness is out there relative to us.
It's a fundamental shift in perspective. This deep dive really changes where you even look for consciousness. If the present, the spread now, is like the shore where all these waves of causality from the past and present conclude. And if your mind is identical to that spread now, then the actual scope of your consciousness is potentially massive. It's reaching out to distant stars whose light is arriving now. It's reaching back through your entire causal history manifested in memory loops, and it's encompassing every physical object you're currently interacting with successfully. The universe isn't just in front of us or represented inside us. In a way, the experienced universe, or at least as a specific body relative part of it, is the thing we are.